So this morning we're looking at the episode in the Srimad Bhagavatam in which Bali Maharaj is doing something quite extraordinary. He is even, um, despite what his guru Shukracharya and what others have advised him to do, he is prepared to give up everything, to lose everything. He's prepared even to become completely poverty-stricken, impoverished, just for the sake of giving and charity, just in the sake, in this case, to give to Vamandev, who appears in the form of this begging brahmachari who asks for charity. Um, this is a section of the Bhagavatam that's very often cited as being such an amazing example, or such an extraordinary um, example of how the devotee sees um, bhakti and surrender to Krishna as the topmost, as that which supersedes everything else, that which trumps everything else. So much so that even generally in like Vedic culture, to disregard the instructions of one's teacher, one's elder, one's mentor, it's often considered something that is a very terrible fault. But in this instance, by doing exactly that, Bali Maharaj is glorified even to this day. Why? Because he recognizes the higher principle. We can't really imitate that. It's a very extraordinary circumstance. But at least we should aspire towards this idea that um, the higher principle is always in pleasing Krishna. That if we're focusing our minds and our hearts on pleasing Krishna, then even if it means doing something that is apparently a cause of fault, then that thing that is generally considered uh, being something that brings us infamy, or that is a fault, is instead transformed into something that is something that's glorified. We see here Srila Prabhupada begins this short purport with a statement that generally when someone becomes poverty-stricken, particularly when the cause of their becoming poverty-stricken is something, you know, um, that is quite embarrassing. So losing money and through gambling, Prabhupada says through gambling, prostitution, or intoxication, or even losing money in business, right? So many times there's a business venture and someone, invests a lot of money in a particular area or something, and then it doesn't work out. And as a result, they're completely, they go bust, right? They're completely poverty stricken. They lose it all. So generally that's something that's quite embarrassing. It's something that is, it's people criticize such a person. Sometimes you see these stories, very often actually tragically, you see stories of people who win the lottery, and then within sometimes a shockingly short amount of time, within just a few years even, um, some of them end up just as destitute as they once were, or even more so. Sometimes they end up terribly in debt, or even more impoverished than they were to begin with. And usually those stories are accompanied by, you start hearing about there's some infighting within the family, or some intrigue, and the person loses the money in some way, or they're tricked out of the money, or maybe in some cases they blow it all on, you know, living very extravagantly beyond even their means as millionaires. And it's a very embarrassing, very kind of it's a really derogatory kind of situation. So generally, losing one's fortune is considered quite a bad thing. But here, um, Prabhupada in the purport, he contrasts this with one who becomes poverty-stricken by giving all of his possessions in charity. When one gives in charity, giving in charity is so extolled that even if one becomes completely poverty-stricken, rather than being criticized for it, one is actually glorified and adored all over the world. This is the power of giving in charity. This is how glorious it is. And so something that's ordinarily considered a fault becomes a cause for glorification. So what excuse can we possibly have not to be magnanimous, not to give in charity, not to be benevolent and merciful here? That even if we are, as the verse says, even if a person is known to be benevolent and merciful, such a person becomes even more auspicious. They become even more famous. They become even more glorified and adored just by giving in charity. So I wanted to take a little bit of time this morning to look at, this idea of giving in charity, and even to the point of a willingness to become completely poverty-stricken, to give everything. I wanted to look at this in a couple of different ways, because I think when we look at a verse or a purport like this, depending on where we're at, depending on our particular vantage point or position, we might understand this in different ways. So there's different layers to this. So I want to look at this on three different layers or three different levels. On the level of being what we might consider a dharmic person. Then secondly, on a level of being a sadhaka. And finally, looking at it on the ultimate level of our ultimate aspiration of Krishna prema. So we can say, looking at it as a dharmi, looking at it as a sadhaka, and then looking at it from the perspective of a premi or a prema bhakta. So on the level of looking at it just in terms of our dharmic responsibility, we can see a verse like this as a glorification of giving and charity, of performing charitable works. How important it is that even if it means, this is an extreme statement, and of course we won't all have this this particular circumstance, but even if it means losing everything, even if it means becoming poverty-stricken ourselves, charity should never be given up. In the Gita, in the final, it's very interesting, in the final chapter of the Gita, in the 18th chapter, just as Krishna is, kind of concluding and giving the essence, which ultimately he will give to Arjuna later in the 18th chapter. But he begins the 18th chapter by stressing this idea that real renunciation is not a giving up of one's duties and responsibilities in this world. And particularly when it comes to giving in charity, to performing sacrifice, to performing some austerity or penance, these things are never to be given up. In the 5th verse of the 18th chapter, Krishna says, Yagya dana tapa karma natyajam karyam evatat. That yagya, sacrifice, dana, charity, and tapa, austerity, these activities, these karmas, natyajam karyam evatat, these should never be given up. These should never be rejected or renounced. And in the purport to that particular verse, Srila Prabhupada says something really beautiful about giving in charity. He says that charity must be given because by charity one purifies the heart, by giving in charity. And so this is, I think, very instructive for all of us, even on the basic level of living with integrity, even on the basic level of living as dharmic people, that we may, yes, our aspiration is the performance of bhakti, but even on this basic level, as long as we have some means, we should be giving in charity. That this should never be given up in the name of renunciation or in the name of spirituality. Sometimes this question arises, whether these injunctions to give in charity, to perform sacrifice, whether these ought to apply to a devotee. And there's certainly statements that indicate that a devotee is not obligated to do, just by giving one's heart and life to Mukunda, to Lord Krishna, one is no longer bound by obligation. But to say one is no longer bound by obligation doesn't necessarily mean that therefore we should use that as an excuse to never perform the activity. Okay, under extraordinary circumstances, we may not we may not be forced to, we may not be bound to, we may not have to suffer some reaction. But that's that's just setting the bar as far as an extraordinary um, situation. But as long as we do have the means, and as long as we are physically able to, and especially for those of us, for one who's in a renounced order of life, whether one is a brahmachari or brahmacharini or sannyasi, or maybe even in more informal sense, if one is practicing monastic life, there may not be such an imperative to give, because the understanding is one is already living their life in such a way that they're, practically speaking, from the moment they wake up to the moment they lay their head down to sleep, and all the hours in between, basically they're living their life in such a way to constantly be giving. So it's understood that for one who is practicing that kind of monasticism, okay, they're already sort of doing it. But especially for those of us who are in householder life, who work and live in the general society, we're benefiting so much in so many ways. We're the recipients of so much. We're participating in society. We're definitely not shy about taking advantage of all the benefits of living and working in that society. So we also have a responsibility. We shouldn't try to game the system, or have a kind of a miserly attitude of what is the least I can do and the most that I can make, right? That's not a very conducive mentality. That's not a very sattvic mentality. Ultimately, that's not a mentality that's going to help us to grow in our Krishna consciousness, in our spiritual life. So instead, we can adopt the mindset that, how can I give? I've been blessed with so much. I'm the recipient of so much. I'm so grateful that Krishna is blessing me in my life in so many different ways, and Krishna blesses me through these different things. How can I give back? Even if it's in a so-called mundane way, even if it's, of course, it's best if we can connect our everything in our life explicitly to Krishna, but sometimes the connection is not so apparent. So, but still, we have a responsibility, especially, again, as I said, for those of us who are grihastas. Um, we're um, it's part of our lifestyle as grihastas, as householders, for those of us who are. Um, we want to cultivate that kind of heart. Sometimes we talk about transcending, that Krishna consciousness, bhakti, transcends all of these material or mundane considerations. Uh, but transcendence doesn't mean that we give up those things, or that we somehow skip over those things, right? We're also transcendence. We're also called to transcend, for instance, family attachment. But that doesn't mean, as some of us on the call may be parents, we may have families of our own. Um, so we know that doesn't mean that we act cruelly towards our families, or we act irresponsibly towards our families, right? It means that we see the bigger picture, that we don't stop there, that we don't say, well, I'm serving my family nicely, I'm being loving towards my family, so that's the be all and end all. We go further. We say, yes, that's nice. And at the same time, that's part of a bigger picture. That if I have so much love for my family, why am I not also seeing all of creation as a family? Why am I not also seeing that Krishna is within the hearts of all? And so let me expand. Like Srila Prabhupada speaks so beautifully, or he writes so beautifully, um, in the preface to the Nectar of Devotion. He writes about our propensity for love expanding. So the idea is not that we do the bare minimum. The idea is we should be expansive. It should be a, like sometimes they say, it's not an either or, it's a both and. So we can, yes, we should be loving towards our families. Yes, we should be charitable. We should do all these things, and we should constantly be striving. So how can I expand that magnanimity? Is that the word? How can I expand that being magnanimous? How can I expand that generosity? How can I expand that love, that compassion? Right? But we're not going to be able to do that if even in these small ways, if we're being petty and hard-hearted and miserly, how will we ever expand that love? How will we ever expand that propensity to be generous and gracious and soft-hearted? We won't, or it'll be very, very difficult, we can say. So even on that level as devotees, even when we take to Krishna, what to speak of for generally for people, giving in charity is such a heart-opening experience that it shouldn't be given up. But even as devotees, it shouldn't be given up. More and more, we should try, how can I connect this to my relationship with Krishna? Ultimately, we are looking to perform those activities that are favorable towards Krishna and towards growing closer in our relationship with Krishna. And we should be looking to minimize those activities. And we can say not just activities, but that kind of mindset that is averse to our connection with Krishna, that limits our connection to Krishna. So cultivating a soft heart, generally speaking, is more favorable towards Krishna. So even from that point of view, towards seeing what is favorable to our bhakti, to give in charity is more favorable to our bhakti. Even if it means performing some sacrifice, even if it means losing out in some way for ourselves materially, right? Better I do that and cultivate this soft heart and expand my capacity for generosity and for graciousness and for being magnanimous. Better I lose on the material end and cultivate a soft heart than I am very safe and secure, materially speaking, but I become hard-hearted. I become um, I become diminished as in my capacity for my qualities. These qualities, being generous and gracious and kind and compassionate, being a friend to all beings, these are the things that a Vaishnava is glorified for. If we don't have those qualities, right, that's our real wealth. In one place in the Bhagavatam, they're called the ornaments of the devotees, sadhu bhushanam. If we're not wearing those ornaments, we can be covered from head to toe in 24 karat gold. We can have so much wealth in our bank accounts and our various stock portfolios and all of these things, but what do we actually have? The real treasure. All of those things will end at the time of death, but the real treasure, the real thing that attracts not just others in this world to us, but that it even attracts our all attractive Lord Krishna, are those qualities. And so on the very basic level, not that giving in charity becomes our be all end all religion. But on the very basic level, let's at least start with building a foundation of generosity, of kindness, of compassion, of giving, of self-sacrifice, right? So from that point of view, we can take inspiration from a verse like this, that Bali Maharaj is encouraging us that even if it means that we lose out materially, we'll never lose out in terms of the cultivation of those qualities. So we should not in any way be hesitant to give in charity when the opportunity presents itself. On the next level, we can say on a slightly deeper level or a level of more maturity in our spiritual life, we can see that everything actually is the property of Krishna. And so on that level as well, when we speak about giving in charity, what are we actually giving? I give something that belongs to me, right? If I see Surabhi, I feel some love and care for her. I want to give her a gift, so I give her something, right? But if I don't possess anything, what do I have to give her? And so, seen from this point of view, the bhakti paradigm is that everything belongs to Krishna. And if everything belongs to Krishna, then in apparently giving some charity, all I'm really doing is I'm moving some of Krishna's property from this place to this place. That's all it really is. Um, of course, the act of giving in charity, the act of being a responsible steward of Krishna's property. This is a word that sometimes is used in the Christian traditions to talk about this idea. It's a beautiful concept, and we have it as well in our tradition, that we are stewards, we are caretakers. When I have the mindset, or the when my paradigm is that of a caretaker, then I don't feel any sense of possessiveness or ownership over that property, but nor do I neglect that property, nor am I irresponsible when it comes to that property, right? It's this beautiful balanced position of recognizing that I don't own anything, and at the same time, I have been entrusted with the most valuable items or objects or possessions. And so it is, in one sense, maximum responsibility and care with minimal attachment and, um, uh, you know, kind of personal desire, or ego. Right? What is the position of a caretaker or a servant from the ego point of view? It's nothing, right? Um, you don't see it so much maybe in the U.S. Maybe you do in really affluent places, but in India, it's very common, for instance, even among the sort of kind of middle class and upper middle class, that there's someone that might be hired to be a driver. So that driver may be driving, an ambassador car, or he may be driving a Maruti, or he may be driving, some really fancy BMW or Mercedes or something like that. Um, but the driver is performing a service. And at the end of the day, the driver doesn't go to sleep thinking, "Oh, I'm such a big man. Today I drove a BMW, and tomorrow I'll drive a Rolls Royce." And because in that sense, of course, it's a material example. Um, but the idea is, you know, from the driver's point of view, I'm performing my responsibility nicely. Um, if I have a little bit of faculty, it's nice, right? The ride will be a little smoother in the BMW maybe than in the old Ambassador. But at the end of the day, that I'm driving for the pleasure of the the person I'm serving. So if even on a mundane level or a material level, a servant can have that kind of can perform their service with that kind of in that kind of mood, what to speak then of the bhakta, who is called to perform that service, not just begrudgingly, not just for a paycheck, right? I mean, the sad fact is, in the context of the driver in India, for instance, generally that person is doing that why? For the paycheck, or to put food on their family's table, or to send their child to get an education, perhaps even thinking that I don't want my child to also become a servant. I want this person, my child, to grow into a person that has wealth of his own, right? But the point is, if we can work so hard for the sake of a paycheck even, then what to speak of what our mood, or the responsibility that we undertake can be, um, for the sake of the most precious important relationship in not just as one lifetime, but in our eternal existence. So that is the paradigm of bhakti. The paradigm of bhakti calls us to see everything as an opportunity to serve. And so when I'm blessed with resources and wealth, I use those things very responsibly, um, very ethically, very carefully. I use those things in a way that's aligned with my spiritual values. And when there's an opportunity to give, I give very freely. When there's an opportunity to uplift others, then I express my compassion, knowing that none of that is mine anyway. It's just the only thing that's mine is the opportunity to express my love for Krishna through my through acting in compassion, through acting as an instrument of compassion. That's really the only thing that I have. because that requires my that it requires my own intention. That requires an exercise of my free will. Everything else, the wealth I may give, the check I may sign, right? All of that, it's actually just Krishna's property anyway. When I see it in that way, then, as I know, like my spiritual master likes to talk about, Radhanath Swami, he likes to talk about giving, or rather, um, what it means to be to be dharmic in one's finances. He's sometimes asked this type of question, especially in settings of like corporate settings and things like that. So he said it means to earn with integrity and to give with compassion. These two things, if we can do these two things, then um, we're actually being careful, responsible stewards of Krishna's wealth. Um, so when we approach it that way, then we see that actually an opportunity to give in charity is a wonderful way to express my Krishna consciousness, to live out my Krishna consciousness, right? Srila Prabhupada used to sometimes give this example of um, one very strictly renounced jnani who would always, if someone were to show some wealth, he would turn his face away. He would say, "No, no, I don't even want to see it." But Prabhupada very playfully said, "But I'm not like that." He said, "If you bring some wealth, I'll open both of my hands and I'll say, yes, yes, bring it, give me, give me." Um, why? To use in Krishna service. And so there are ways of directly using wealth in Krishna's service, but there's also opportunities to be in Krishna's service by giving in an appropriate way, to uplift others, to care for others, right? Um, to cultivate that soft heart for ourselves and to uplift and encourage others on every level. On the level, ultimately, we want to uplift people we want to uplift all living beings on the spiritual level. But we don't also neglect the other levels, the bodily, the mental, the emotional level, right? A Vaishnava is very kind and compassionate on all of those levels. I heard Radhika Raman Prabhu, one of my dear friends and mentors and role models, he gave this really nice example. He said, you know, if someone is if someone is let's say a world-renowned brain surgeon, like a neurosurgeon, and they're walking down the street and they see someone, um, just like a stranger, collapses on the ground and is in need of CPR. They don't say, "Oh, well, I'm a neurosurgeon. CPR is a very basic, simple thing. Anyone can do CPR. I'm a neurosurgeon. I only deal on that level. So this is, I transcend this." The neurosurgeon gets down on his hands and knees or her hands and knees, and they do the needful. They recognize that, okay, fine. Yes, ultimately, my training, my expertise, my talents are to be used on this very high level. But I don't neglect when there's a need in front of me and I have the opportunity to serve on the most basic level. I do that as well. So, in a similar way, for the devotee, yes, ultimately, our aspiration is to be charitable and magnanimous and generous, to give and uplift on the highest level. And so, there are these statements that to give to give Krishna to others is the highest welfare work, the highest act of charity. And on a certain level, spiritually, yes, that's true. And at the same time, that's not an excuse for us to ignore all of those opportunities to be responsible, giving, dharmic citizens, even as sadhakas, right? The two are not in conflict. It's a both and. Now, ultimately, um, what this we can say on the ultimate level. So we looked at the sort of the base level, dharmic level. We've looked a little bit at seeing this propensity to give, or this opportunity to give in charity, on the level of a sadhaka, working on cultivating this mindset and this heart set of being a servant of Krishna and what that means. And on the ultimate level, when that heart set of being a servant of Krishna sort of blossoms and finds its perfection, on the ultimate level, we recognize that we are called to give everything. We are called to dedicate our very lives to Krishna. Um, this is what Bali Maharaj embodies, this notion of Atma Nivedana. Here, Atma means the self. It can mean the self. Generally, we talk about Atma as the spirit soul, and the self in that ultimate level. But Atma can also be used to mean the body, the mind, um, any notion of ourself, our words, our activities, anything that by which we define ourselves. Let that not be something that separates me from Krishna. Let that not be a separate identity. This is a different understanding than the Advaita understanding of the the Atman and the Brahman merging into one. That's not our Siddhanta. Our Siddhanta is we want to be one in terms of our love and our service. So the example is given sometimes like that when you offer camphor, it's very common in puja as the final offering. Even there's an offering of camphor. And if you offer a lamp with camphor in it, it's very interesting. One of the characteristics is it that block of camphor, it burns really brightly. And when it's done, when that flame has been offered, at the end, what do you find in that lamp? You really find nothing. Good quality camphor. Sometimes maybe you find a little like black smudge or something, but good quality camphor, it it's completely gone. It completely gives so fully of itself that there's no separate identity left. And it sounds like an extreme statement, but this is our aspiration, that we want to give so fully of ourselves to Krishna, or in service of Krishna, that really there's nothing left that's separate, right? I take this in a very practical way that can sound very confronting or very challenging. It can sound very extreme, like, oh, I'm not there at all. Maybe I'll never get there. I'll never be like a Bali Maharaj. We may not be there in that literal sense, but we can take this in a practical way as an aspiration, as a reminder that, am I separating out anything in my life from my relationship with Krishna? And if I am, then let me interrogate that. Let me investigate that. Let me see what's keeping me from connecting even that thing to Krishna, right? Sometimes we have this notion that, okay, I perform my sadhana here, and then I've got this facet of my life, right? I'm a student, so I have my academics, or I'm a business person, so I have my business life. I'm a parent, so I have my parental life. And when I'm in the temple, when I'm chanting my rounds in the morning, when I'm offering arti, then I'm a devotee. But when I'm a parent, I'm a parent. And when I'm a student, I'm a student. But that's a very, you can say, superficial or immature understanding of Krishna consciousness, right? Krishna consciousness means, um, well, consciousness throughout my consciousness and everything that I do. Where is Krishna? As a parent, where is Krishna in that equation? As a parent, if I'm a Krishna conscious parent, it's not just between me and my child. Everything I do in how I speak to that child, how I inspire that child, how I care for that child, even in how I may correct or punish that child, right? Krishna is in that equation. So how careful should I be? Um, how cognizant should I be, right? Just like when we're standing in front of Radha Muralidhar Gaurachandra, we should be a little bit, right? We don't just say anything that's on the top of our minds. We don't just act in any old way. We're very cognizant. We recognize I'm in front of the deities now. But why just when we're in front of the deities? Why not recognize that Krishna is there at every moment? Krishna is there in every interaction. Krishna is there in every facet of our life. If we can do that in a very simple way, we're practicing a kind of an Atma Nivedana, where we are submitting our entire selves, just like Bali Maharaj. And we do so with this faith that when I do that, I'm never going to be the loser, that Krishna will always care for me. Krishna will always maintain me. Krishna's in control. Even if it means apparently losing everything on the material level, I will have gained the greatest wealth, because I will have I'll have attracted, oh, I'll have endeared myself to Krishna's lotus feet. So I'll stop there. We may have a few minutes for some questions, comments, reflections before we greet the deities. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Venkata Bhatta Prabhu. Extremely interesting how you brought up various points. I have one anonymous question here. Is Krishna pleased more by who we give charity to or the mood in which we give?
Is Krishna
Actually,
more?
it's a question from Daniel.
But you just said it was anonymous, but now you've.
No, he said I can take his name.
Okay. I thought you removed his anonymity. It's a great question. I My understanding is that, well, first of all, that it doesn't have to be an either or, right? That
Hmm.
Krishna is pleased by seeing the mood in which we're giving, by seeing our application of intelligence in discerning who to give to. The question, for those who didn't get to hear the question, is Krishna more pleased with who we're giving the charity to, if I'm understanding correctly, or the mood in which we're giving it to? In other words, which is the more important consideration, we can say, in Krishna's eyes. And so the first way I would answer that is it's not an either or, it's a both and. That Krishna is pleased with our intention and our consciousness, and he's also pleased with our discernment and intelligence. Right? We have, maybe from a material standpoint, we may have limited time and energy and resources. Of course, Krishna's resources are unlimited, but in our two hands, they appear to be a little limited. So we have to use our intelligence. We have to use our discernment, and that pleases Krishna as well. Krishna identifies himself as the intelligence of the intelligent. So when we maximize our intelligent use of resources, Krishna is happy. So it's all of those. If I were forced to say one or the other, my understanding is Krishna is especially known as Bhavagrahi Janardana. So the mood, the consciousness, that, my understanding, is what is always touches the heart of Krishna, you can say, more than anything else. Even if there's some apparent faults on other levels, the more we're moving towards that pureness, that purity of heart, and that really sincere, heartfelt intention, um, the more we're kind of getting at that essence of what pleases Krishna. I hope that's okay. Thank you for that beautiful question, Daniel.
Thank you, bro. Here, Mother Brajani is also saying that how she really liked the class, and also this point that how to be more conscious of Krishna in everything we do, and also not creating like separating things like this role is like I'm in this role or in this role, but like seeing everything like integrated. So that was a inspiring point for me also.
Yeah, and
Thank
thank you for that word. I don't think I used that word explicitly, but it's the perfect word for it, right? Integration.
you.
To have integrity means, among other things, to be integrated.
That's a beautiful concept of having integrity. One way of having integrity is to see Krishna in every aspect of our life.
Absolutely.
Everything you speak is coming out like a sutra. So,